Welcome, everyone, to the Native Voices in STEM. We're pleased to have Dr. TallBear with us today, and we're excited to hear from her. This seminar series is co-sponsored by the University of Arizona Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership and the NSF NRT Indigenous Food, Energy, Water Security, and Sovereignty Program, and the School of Natural Resources and Environment. My name is Carletta Chief, and I am an associate professor and extension specialist in environmental science, and I am the PI of the IndigiFuse program. I am pleased to introduce our special speaker today, Dr. Kim TallBear, who is an associate professor at the University of Alberta. Dr. TallBear is working to build a research and training program at the University of Alberta that is focused on Indigenous peoples' engagements with science and technology, as those fields and projects serve Indigenous self-determination. As a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, she aims to achieve research excellence in engineering and the natural sciences, health sciences, humanities, and social sciences. Dr. TallBear is an enrolled member of the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate in South Dakota, descended from the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. Thank you so much, Dr. TallBear, and I would like to go ahead and turn the platform over to you. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. I was asked to give a talk that mostly outlines what my research is, but also situates that research within the historical pathway that got me to where I began asking the kinds of questions that I ask. So I'm going to give a little bit of basic background about how I came to the methods and ethics and questions that I have. And so you'll see that the title of the talk is, I think, different than what the poster said. I'm still going to get at decolonization of science and technology in this because that's the center of what I work on. But I want to talk about how I study those who study us as Indigenous people. I study anthropologists and geneticists who study Indigenous genomes, draw blood, do cultural anthropology sometimes, genetic anthropology. So I'm really interested in returning that gaze. And that's really what a lot of my work is about. And why is it important for Indigenous people to return the gaze? I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides, why that is such a critical project. And while I'm not only somebody who studies, well, basically I'm a de facto anthropologist of white people, because most scientists, engineers, and people that do technology development in the Americas, at least in the colonial era, have been white people, largely straight white men. So that is kind of de facto who I study, because they tend to be the ones that have control over the institutions and cultures that we all have to deal with, the cultures and institutions that are ruling over all of us. And so I think all of us know, many of us know, who are not white men in power, that we have to understand their world and cultures as well as we understand our own in order to operate effectively in that culture. So let's go to the next slide, please. Where I'll situate myself a little bit. So one of the theoretical frameworks that I use, and many of you out there who might engage in feminist theories and methods will understand what I say when I talk about situating myself. But it's not only feminist theorists who have talked about the importance of situating ourselves in relationship to our research. So saying where we come from, how we come to the questions that we ask, how we get there. But I was raised implicitly in a family and a culture that also required that we situate ourselves. So, you know, when you move throughout Indian country, the first thing people ask you about yourself is not what you do for a living. They ask you, where are you from? What tribe are you? Oh, who are your parents? Who are your grandparents? Oh, I know this person from there. We're always being asked to situate ourselves because people are trying to situate themselves in relationship to you. And this is a really important way of interacting in Indian country. For some people who are not accustomed to it, it can be taken as a form of interrogation of one's authenticity, but the way that I grew up, that's not what it was. It was simply people needed to know who my grandparents and my parents were so they could situate me, so they knew how to treat me within that broader history and how to recognize where I came from. And so I'm going to do that in relationship to this work. So these are just some visuals of where I come from. I was raised in Dakota homelands, which are now basically the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, southern Minnesota. But in the reservation era, Dakota people were pushed out of Minnesota into eastern South Dakota. It tends to be that on the eastern side of the Missouri River, it's Dakota people. On the western side in South Dakota is Lakota. So I'm raised in the eastern side of South Dakota, going between the Flanders-Santee Sioux Reservation, where my grandparents moved in the 30s, back up to Sisseton-Wahpeton, Oyate. People between Flanders and Sisseton tend to be related, both Dakota peoples, and then also into the Twin Cities where my mother worked. So rivers are really important to me. That's the Big Sioux, which is the river that runs through my home community in Flanders that it's really disgusting, but we swam in there as kids. Like it was probably pretty dirty from agricultural runoff, but it's really, it was an important place. That's my ancestor in the middle, Little Crow or Oyate Duta, who was one of the people who led the Dakota War against settlers in 1862. Some of you will know the largest mass execution ever performed in the United States was 38 Dakota men and boys after that war, December 26, 1862 in Mankato, Minnesota. So that's the kind of history I come out of. And after, I often say that we are post-apocalyptic people, and we are as Indigenous people. There's been a lot of, what's the word? Frenzy and fear around the last few years, especially in the United States. And there are real crises. Climate crisis is a real crisis. People are worried about something they're calling the Anthropocene. They're worried about the decline of US empire. And there's all this kind of proliferation of apocalyptic scenarios, right? That settlers are feeling really on the edge right now. I think in terms of the state of their culture and their nation state, but Indigenous peoples have been post-apocalyptic. My people for 8 generations now, we're 8 generations away from 1862, where our entire lifeways, our political economy, our landscape, our communities, everything was completely refigured in that time. And you know, across the Americas, Indigenous peoples have suffered sometimes up to 90% population decline due to various kind of genocidal tactics, disease, displacement. So this is the history in which Dakota people today try to not only survive, but thrive. And so that's a little bit recognizable to many of you. Let's go to the next slide. So that was the historical part of where I come from, but these are a few of my formative theorists. And I don't only think about the important theorists that have influenced me academically as being people that I read about in the academy or that I studied under in the university. And I did study under a couple of important people in my PhD. They're not listed here because they weren't formative for me, but my PhD advisors at UC Santa Cruz were very influential in the work that I do. So James Clifford and Donna Haraway for various reasons were important, but they weren't the first theorists that made me want to do what I want to do and that made me a critical thinker. Those theorists were my mom, that young woman in the black and white kind of 1960s do up in the left-hand corner. That's my mother's high school graduation picture, Leanne TallBear. She raised me in a household in which I would come home every day with these whitewashed stories about Native history and about US history. And my mom was an undergraduate I was born in 68. And so in the late 60s, early 70s, she was an undergraduate at Northern State College in Aberdeen, South Dakota. She had 4 children. Was a single mom technically, but of course my grandmothers were very involved in my upbringing. But I would come home and I would ask her questions about things I learned in school, and she would set me straight, not only with a very politically oppositional kind of assessment of US history, but she told us about our oral histories, and my broader family told us about the 1862 war, told us about Little Crow, told us about that time in history. So I grew up knowing that directly through my family line. But there were also books in my house like Vine Deloria Jr.'s Custer Died for Your Sins, published in 1969. Vine Deloria Jr. was probably the most influential Native American scholar of the 20th century, at least coming out of the United States or lands now occupied by the US. When I was about 4 years old, I asked my mom, what does this mean, Custer died for your sins? Because that was all in the air at that time. The American Indian movement was was very active at that time. There were students who were involved in AIM, and I was a little kid growing up around that. So I heard this phrase a lot. I knew the phrase, Jesus died for your sins. And I knew who Custer was. I knew he was a bad guy, but I didn't even know what Jesus died for your sins meant. So how was I going to know what Custer died for your sins meant? But I remember that's how formative that book and those ideas were. This is at the same time Native American Studies is getting going as a field. So you've got a collection of scholars there in the upper right-hand part of the slide. I will say, I do find AIM problematic, particularly in terms of the masculinist politics, but that's a story for another time. So I'm not lionizing AIM here by bringing them up, but it was incredibly important, that movement, for a lot of reasons. And so I'll leave that there. And so it was just important at that time. At the center of this slide is a visual from Red Schoolhouse, which was a survival school, started in part by the American Indian movement. There were survival schools both in the United States and in Canada at that time, and these were culture-based curriculums. My mother worked there. A lot of our extended family worked there. I went there for a bit as a child. So did my siblings. This was a really important place. And I learned a lot about what I would call formative theory there. I learned that it is important, again, to tell stories from out of our own lives, that we should tell our own stories, that Indigenous languages, in the case of Red Schoolhouse, it was in Anishinaabe, should guide learning, that the fundamental cultural precepts and worldviews embodied in those languages should guide all of our academic learning. And so there were academic classes at Red Schoolhouse, but language and culture and ceremony were central. And so I consider that kind of a formative theoretical moment for me. And so when I got to graduate school, I was really prepared to take on some of the theory that I got from non-Indigenous academics about situating myself, feminist theory, dismantling hierarchies in knowledge production. But I got those things implicitly throughout my growing up. And then just one final person who's here, that's Laura Nader. I think Laura's still alive and work. She's an anthropologist at Berkeley. She published an article around the same time Vine Deloria Jr. published Custer Died for Your Sins, called Up the Anthropologists, where she said we should study power. Why are we always studying the poor native, the poor disempowered native? We should be studying those in power. So this is during the middle of the Vietnam War. She's advocating studying people in government, studying people in corporations. Who gives us trouble, right? Who gives the people trouble? The rich and the powerful. And for Indigenous people, it's white settlers that gave us trouble. Vine Deloria Jr. said the same thing. He had a really hilarious essay because he poked fun a lot. That's how he taught people lessons, called Anthropologists and Other Friends, in that book. And so he was basically studying and poking fun at white power structures in all of his work. So I don't think he and Laura Nader had anything to do with each other, but this is the ethos at the time, right? During the middle of the opposition to the Vietnam War, during the Red Power movement, American Indian movement, during Black Power, the Black Panthers, you had Chicano movements going on. So this is the time when all of this stuff is happening. So very important time to grow up. Okay, we can go to the next slide and I'll start talking about research now. So growing up in that world, with those kinds of oppositional and critical influences, both at home and coming out of books, it makes sense that later on I'm concerned about the way that lenses of race and racial science have been used to objectify Native people. Now, I probably first got wind of racial science by hearing about and reading Vine Deloria Jr.'s work, because he talked about the role of anthropology in colonization. I mean, he and others have talked about, for example, the grave robbers who are working on contract for academics at prestigious institutions, say at Columbia and Harvard, are going out to massacre sites after the Indian Wars, pulling bodies off of the land. I'm going to say something here that's a little bit disturbing, just so you know what kind of graphic. Pulling those bodies off the massacre sites, boiling them down to bone and sending the bones out east. So desecrating remains, right? Even robbing graves. This was done in the name of science, right? Because knowledge for the good of all is always what's really important, right? So I knew about that history. Oh, I should back up a little bit too. So my first career is as an environmental policy analyst, not as an academic. I was working for federal agencies, tribal governments, tribal organizations. I had a master's and an undergraduate degree in planning and environmental policy. I happened to be working doing liaison work between the US Department of Energy and tribes near to nuclear waste facilities in the late 90s. Early 2000s, the Department of Energy decides to start putting some of its money towards mapping the human genome. And they're funding grants to look at Indigenous participation in the mapping of the human genome. The organization that I work for decided to go for one of those grants. I'm sitting at meetings with tribal reps around the table. I'm trained as an environmental planner. I was fascinated with the conversations that were happening around genetics, race, people being concerned, well, if they map the human genome, can they maybe make biological weapons that will target certain peoples? And I didn't know a lot of genetics, but I knew enough to say, I don't think that's probably possible since everybody's genetically related. That made me want to go back and do a PhD and write the dissertation that became my book, Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and the False Promise of Genetic Science. So at that moment in 2000, I'm becoming interested in these questions. And then I applied to do a PhD and I went in and I began to study what I'm going to talk about now for the next 15 or 20 minutes. So I get into graduate school and I know I'm going to write this dissertation on the politics of Native American DNA research, human migrations research. Those of you in Arizona will remember the Havasupai case, right? So this is happening just a few years before I decided to write this dissertation. So there's a lot of pushback in the late 90s, early to mid to late 90s against human genome diversity research, against human migrations research, against the drawing of blood for this kind of research, the mistreatment of Indigenous subjects. And this is the moment I'm coming into graduate school. So I start studying a little bit of history of science, and that visual off to the left is that. This is a visual from a 19th century textbook that's showing you the cultural evolutionary theory at the time, that the idea was that Black people had stopped evolving, Africans had stopped evolving. There are other textbooks that would show the Indian or the Native American in the middle. They were considered barbarians. Their evolution was halted by the arrival of the white man, who's represented in that left-hand visual by Apollo, by some Greek statue. And this is the era of craniometry, where they're measuring the volumes of skulls and they're looking at phrenology and they're measuring faces, trying to prove an assumption that they already had, which is that Europeans were at the top of the hierarchy of life, and Black people, Native people, and non-human animals and plants go down the hierarchy of life. So this is a kind of central to a European worldview at the time, not only in science, also in Christianity, also their civilizational structures in the form of their emerging nation states. This hierarchy of cultural evolution is central to their worldview, to them evangelizing all of the things they're evangelizing: Christianity, science, and the state. So let's fast forward to right before World War II, 1939. This German scientist is measuring a Tibetan woman's cranium. This is a physical anthropologist. The School of American Anthropology was physical anthropology at the time. There's a lot of back and forth between the US, the UK, and Germany. The US is very much at the forefront. The eugenics movement is science here. This is not pseudoscience. This was cutting edge science. This guy goes back to Germany and advises doctors in the death camps in Germany. So there's the US after World War II, the US and England, probably Canada as well, realized they're pretty culpable in some of the racial horrors that were happening during World War II. That's a whole other story. And there's a lot of articles you can read about the scientists and biologists grappling with the complicity of their field and what happened in Germany and throughout Europe during World War II. So that's 1939. Jump forward a little bit more to the 40s and 1950s. In Canada, you had these nutritional experiments happening. And I've got some quotes I'm going to read to you. People like to think Canada's all nice, but settler colonialism didn't work too much differently here. There were less Indian wars, as far as I understand, but a lot of this other kind of stuff is very similar between the US and Canada. So there were nutrition experiments conducted on First Nations people in Manitoba, and in 6 residential schools across Canada. There were also elders in community who were involved in some of these experiments, and they were used as a living laboratory for nutrition scientists. The documents show that some of the subjects were almost starving at this time. So here were the research questions that these nutrition scientists in Canada were asking. And I quote, was the shiftless indolent, inert Indian, really simply a malnourished subject. So shiftless, indolent, and inert are all synonyms for laziness, lack of ambition, and an inability to move, to be active. Remember, some of these subjects were starving. Residential schools, we've had the Whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission grappling with this. Children are stolen from their families, incarcerated in residential schools, forbidden to speak their language, right? Forbidden from being around their siblings, the only family they might have, divided into these gender binary categories, girls over here, boys over here. We know about the extent of emotional, physical, sexual abuse in residential schools. And the question these scientists are asking is, are these Indians shiftless, indolent, and inert because they're malnourished? Well, The second question, were foods supplied by traders inadequate in light of modern nutritional knowledge? Why is food being supplied by traders? Well, the land has been stolen. Lifeways, food systems come to an abrupt halt in the colonial era. And these are the questions that these researchers can be bothered to ask. Why? Because it's not colonization that's the problem, right? Colonization evangelizes Christianity, it evangelizes scientific rationality, it evangelizes good citizenship. So that's not what's in question. So it must be the Indian body, culture, and system and society that's deviant. And so that's what they're asking, right? So it matters who's doing the gazing, out of what culture, history, and set of values they're coming from, as to what they are capable of seeing, the questions that they're capable of asking. And that's why I say it's important to figure out who's asking what questions, out of what history, out of what worldviews, and toward what end, right? Okay, we can go to the next slide. So yeah, for me, the questions are, and these are the anti-colonial questions are, because you need to ask these kinds of questions if you're talking about decolonization, if you're talking about opposing colonialism. You need to ask yourself, who gets to gaze at others? Now look at this picture. This is probably somewhere in Africa. We all know it's an old Toyota Land Rover. These are white people with huge zoom cameras. Now, can you imagine a bunch of Africans up in the Land Rover taking pictures of some white people in suburban America? That's not what we expect to see, right? Africans aren't the ones that gaze on whiteness. It's white people that get to do the gazing on the primitive savages. There could be African people out there, or there could be animals. Either way, both of those images would make sense within our what we have come to expect to see in terms of who gets to gaze. So who gets to gaze at others? Who gets to study others? When I get up and give talks, say at the American Society for Human Genetics, and I say that I study white people, people are like, is she kidding? That's kind of rude. Well, is it? Is it rude? So who or what gets studied? Who gets to play God? Now I'm going to talk about a little bit of feminist theory here. Who gets to play God? And what does that mean, that God trick that my PhD advisor, Donna Haraway, talks about? Well, God is omnipotent, right? Supposedly. God is everywhere at the same, God sees everything, but we can't see God. Right? God is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. This is kind of what science does, or what masculinist science does. I'm going to talk later about how it doesn't have to be that way. This is what how people portray objectivity. Who gets to be objective, who gets to play God, who gets to be unencumbered by this history. So when I come in and I tell you that my history and how I come to the questions that I have, the methods that I use, this is something that can be frowned upon in standard scientific communities, where you're supposed to be objective, where you're supposed to have no stake in your research. Am I supposed to believe, in a world where it's largely straight white male scientists, increasingly women, who are studying brown and black bodies, that they have no stake in that there's no political foundation beneath that kind of uneven process of who gets to gaze and who doesn't? So these are the questions we need to ask ourselves all the time when we're looking at research. Who's asking the questions? What questions are they asking? What methods are they using? What ethical frameworks, which people's ethical frameworks are they using? And why isn't the gaze going back in the other direction? Okay, we can go to the next slide. So a little bit about what's in my book and some of the articles I've published. So when I have a chapter in Native American DNA on the history of the science. So some of that history of racial science. I've got some text on the academic research on human migrations, human genome diversity research, something on their methods, how they sample. Their definitions of indigeneity that they use to sample and that conflict with our definitions of tribal belonging or indigenous belonging. And so that's what's represented on the right-hand side of this slide in what I would call 21st century colonial science. I mean, we have this idea that after World War II, when people realized the horror of what racial science did, that it ended. But a lot of historians, anthropologists, and sociologists of science have written on the fact that it hasn't ended. It gets recombined. Old school racial science and racial categories might get renamed and recombined with newer, more multicultural, supposedly anti-racist ways of thinking. So what happens is in the late 20th and early 21st century, it becomes a little bit more complicated or difficult to spot where the older ideas of race are still influencing the way that we do human genome diversity research. So this quote is from this scientist, Spencer Wells. He was working for National Geographic, but there's many academic scientists who are working within standard academic institutions who have had similar ideas. When they're going to try to sample Indigenous people, to draw their blood, to look at their genomes and trace histories of human migration and which populations in the world today are related to which populations historically, how are people related, say, between somewhere in Northern Africa and somewhere in Europe, or somewhere between Asia and the Americas. They're looking at these sets of markers and their frequencies around the world. Well, what they really want are indigenous peoples, though, around the world. They want people that are less admixed. And that's how they're defining indigeneity in part, as less admixed. That's not necessarily how we define it, right? Think about your tribal citizenship criteria. Think about your informal kinship criteria for how you determine who is a member of your community or a citizen of your tribe. So this quote from Spencer Wells, when they're going out to look for 100,000 people to sample for the research project he was involved in, he says, ideally, they would be living in the same place as their ancestors did centuries ago. I guess he's never heard of relocation. They should have been relatively isolated from immigration from surrounding groups who have moved into the region recently. He's never heard of federal relocation in the mid-20th century. He's never heard of residential schools. Also probably hasn't heard of the Indian Conference Circuit. They should retain some of their ancestors' ways of life, be it language, outlawed, forbidden, marriage patterns, outlawed, forbidden, or other cultural attributes. In other words, what we want are indigenous people. So his definition of indigenous people is somebody who was never subjected to colonization. Now, I don't know anybody not subjected to colonization. Do you? I don't know anybody untouched by settler ways of life. This is, he wants the vanishing dead Indian of the past. That's really hard to find and doesn't really exist. And because of the cultural power of genetics and genetic science, whose definition comes to matter more in the eyes of the public, Spencer Wells's definition or our definitions, which are much more complicated? So that's one thing I talk about in that book. This ad, The Truth is in the DNA, this is from a company called Orchid Cellmark that was selling genetic ancestry tests, the kind of tests that Elizabeth Warren took to find her relationship to founding populations. And they were also selling DNA parentage tests. And I get into the book the difference between the two. Tribal governments in the US and First Nations in Canada use parentage tests quite often. Usually it's so they can invoke the tribal enrollment criteria, the genealogical documentation, say if parentage is in question. Say you want to go get a child enrolled in a tribe and parentage is in question. It will more often be the biological paternity than maternity, right? They'll go do a parentage test or a paternity test, and then they can invoke the biological father's documentation for enrollment. So tribes use that, and that's useful. I would love to live in a world in which we could get beyond something like that, but I understand the usefulness of that. That's very different than the kind of DNA test that Elizabeth Warren took, which was to show a probable linkage to founding populations, no individuals named, no tribal communities named. It's just probable ancestry somewhere in the Americas. Who knows back how far? So Orchid Cellmark's selling both kinds of tests. What's interesting about this ad, and I looked at a lot of the cultural production of companies, so their advertisements, their language, their marketing, it's really interesting to see the kinds of images and visuals that come out of 19th century racial thinking that they're still using. I don't really have time to get into it, but this visual is very similar to this vanishing American visual that was really popular in the late 19th through the mid 20th century of the sort of Indian in silhouette on horseback going into the sunset sunset. Why? Well, because the Indian's vanishing, because the Indian is unfit to live in U.S. civilization. You know, they're culturally less of, I mean, all of this is coming out of the 19th century, but images deployed today, whether people know it or not, who are doing the marketing, are reminiscent of these very explicitly racist images and ideas that were deployed widely in the 19th century. And so I look at how contemporary ideas continue to inhere some of these older ideas. So this was an example of Indigenous peoples as subjects. So one of the things I look at in my research is 4 roles for Indigenous people in relationship to science and technology: as subjects or objects, as collaborators. We can go to the next slide. As scientists, and as people who use science and technology to govern. And this all comes to the fore in this program, the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, which was hosted at the University of Arizona in 2017. So this program, singh is the abbreviation, was founded in the US in 2011. I was one of the people who was working on ethics and decolonial politics around genomics. We also had scientists who co-founded this organization. When we started in 2011 in the US, all of the scientific faculty were non-Indigenous, and the people who worked on ethics, legal, and social issues were Indigenous. Now, almost 10 years later, our scientific leadership of singh is Indigenous. We've got an Eastern Band Cherokee person, Matt Anderson. We've got most of our scientists, I would say, are Diné or Navajo. For some reason, you all have a lot of scientists, and I think I know why. It's historically, it's really interesting, but a lot of scientists and engineers, and focus on producing scientists and engineers in Navajo Nation. So we're very Navajo heavy right now, which is great in many ways. But we've also got you have to be Indigenous to apply to the singh program. 14 to 22 participants every summer. We can maybe talk more about that in the Q&A. So we came to Canada in 2018. So I'm one of the co-founders of Singh Canada. We have Singh Aotearoa New Zealand, which was founded in 2016, and Singh Australia came on board in January 2020. So again, training Indigenous scientists, but these are people who are often doing science degrees within the university. When they get to us for a week in the summertime, one of the main benefits for them is being in a lab and in classrooms and in lectures and going on field trips with other Indigenous scientists or aspiring scientists. Because often when they were doing their science degrees or their postdocs, because we also get postdocs and new assistant professors, they were the only Native person in the room, the only Native person in the class. And often they will say, people at home said, why do you want to do this? This kind of science has been used to exploit our people. But they're really interested in doing this work, and they also want to do this work in a way that gives back to community. And so one of the things we emphasize in this program, we can go to the next slide, is situating your science. They also do bioinformatics labs. We can go to the next slide after that. So that's the biostatistical stuff. But situating your work in relationship to the needs of your community. And so one of the interesting things that I've discovered with a lot of these young Indigenous scientists, and I started out interviewing them, I got so demoralized only gazing at white scientists and being opposed to their projects that I said, why don't I go study Indigenous scientists? You know, so the power dynamics might be more even because they're PhDs and I'm a PhD, and maybe it'll be less hierarchical and more of a conversation. And when I was interviewing them for some articles I wrote, I became more invested in their careers and in their work and helping promote what they were doing than in studying them. So it's an interesting position to be in. So now I think I work more collaboratively with them than I study them anymore, because I'm so invested in what they're doing and helping them do that work. So what was I going to say here? So, oh, I lost my train of thought. Let's see. Well, let's look at this picture here. So these are, and we have disproportionately a lot of women too. So for some reason, the gendered patterns of colonization result in Native women attaining higher education at higher levels than do Native men. So we have a lot of woman-led scientific leadership in Singh. And so that's a Katrina Claw on the left. She's an assistant professor at University of Colorado at Denver. She just opened up her lab there in the last year. Oh, I know what I was going to say. The young Indigenous scientists that I worked with were not actually pursuing questions on Indigenous samples or with Indigenous communities. They often tended to be leery of working with Indigenous communities. They wanted to get their degrees, get established as scientists first, learn how to do this work well before they were to come home and work with their communities, because they were really aware of how sensitive this is. They wanted to get it right. And so they've been very slow moving, very patient and deliberate in how they work. And this is the way that we need scientists to work. But because they're coming from those communities and they're so beholden to maintaining good relations in their tribal communities, they've been really careful and really thoughtful. So the other person next to Katrina is Francine Gachupin, who is Jemez Pueblo, who's at U of A. Our Singh program at Arizona in 2017 focused on cancer genomics, and there's a specialty group there working on that. That's me, the only non-scientist in there. And then Dr. Naniba Garrison, who's also Dene, who is now at UCLA, who was trained in genetics at Stanford and is now doing bioethics at UCLA. I know Katrina and Naniba have been working on some projects together, I think with Navajo Nation. I'm not in the loop on that, but that's exactly, if anybody's going to work on genomics with Navajo Nation, it should be Navajo scientists, I think. So let's go to the next slide. So that's some of the kinds of great networks that have come out of the Singh. These are just the LC discussions. So the lingo in the US is ethical, legal, social implications. So we talk about policy, we talk about bioethical rules, both federal, how tribes do research review. In Canada, the acronym is GELS. It's the same thing as LC in the United States. So we're having very similar programs in the US and Canada. I would say the main difference is in Canada, we're tending to focus on non-human genomic issues, where I think in the US, they focus more on humans. And then we're dealing with different federal infrastructures. We have provincial funding agencies up here. The provinces tend to have a lot more power vis-a-vis the federal government than states do in the US. So there's a whole kind of regulatory regime I've had to learn in terms of doing similar kinds of work in Canada as to what I was doing in the United States. We can go to the next slide. I want to finish up in the next couple minutes so we can talk. So this is just where Singh is going around the world. So I guess the point of this is that I started out doing anthropology of science, returning the gaze, studying scientists, but I kind of then began to draw on my previous expertise and orientation as a planner. And I began to think about, how do I help develop, if I'm being so critical of the bad science and where it's gone wrong, how do I help develop the good science that can actually serve rather than undermine tribal sovereignty? And that's one of the things that I think Singh can help do. And that's why I kind of, it's interesting to live on that line between now being an academic who studies scientists and still being a planner who wants to use these insights to develop institutions and programs that serve our peoples. And so we've also been in conversations with people from Latin America recently who are interested in starting a Singh program in those areas. I have a lot more to say about that, but no time yet. Let's go to the next slide, see what else I have in here. Oh, these are just pictures of Singh. This is Singh Canada. We've had 2 years in Singh Canada. Of course, we had to cancel because of COVID in both countries. Singh USA has, I think, had 7 cohorts now. People are out in universities. They're getting their PhDs, their new assistant professors, their postdocs. We also have community members who apply to come to Singh every summer. So say you're somebody at home working for tribal government who's got to think about brokering research agreements, who wants to make sure that the tribal community is brokering an agreement or a research project that's actually serving them, where you're not just being guinea pigs for some scientists. That's though the people like that come in and do Singh as well. So they make contacts, learn the rules and the lingo, and get a sense for the culture of science. Okay, let's go to the next slide. In Canada, we want to do different. So the US has started moving towards themes too. So they did pharmacogenomics at the University of Washington in 2018, cancer genomics at University of Arizona in 2017. We're doing the same thing in Canada. We did clam and conservation genomics. We did chronic wasting disease. We're going to do something around H. pylori and the microbiome as soon as we can get up and running again after COVID. But my goal is to have us do a Singh program in every Canadian province and territory in the next 12 years. And the territories can be pretty rural. So I'm really thinking about how we do a summer genome training program in a place where they might not have the kinds of lab facilities that a big research university would have. But that's really interesting to me, because I don't think we should necessarily only be beholden to big money, right? To big federal funding in order to do good science. So I want to think about how we do what I call small s science versus big S science that requires all the heavy funding. Okay, next slide. So that's a goal. Oh, these were the Sing USA workshop themes. And it was at University of Illinois for a while. Then it started moving around about 5 years ago. Okay, next slide. One of the things we also, and this is the last one, and then we can talk. We also, it's not just the Sing Summer Program. There's a lot of mentoring that goes on. And as you get younger scientists moving up through the ranks, like, getting their own lab, learning how to write grants, doing their publications, they mentor the students coming through. And so we're pretty strategic in some of these collaborative publications that people have done about figuring out, as you would in a lab, who's going to be first author, who's going to be last author, who's going up for tenure, who's writing a big grant right now. So they're pretty strategic in saying about helping one another and mentoring one another get through the process, because it's very challenging, right? It's challenging once you get the PhD, the work has just begun. Getting your lab up and going and getting your work up and going. So there's a lot of ongoing attention to that as well. And that's what the Sing Consortium globally is really good at. We have had every few years a global meeting where we network, where we trade lessons. We also exchange students and faculty. So some people from the US have gone to New Zealand. We've had people from Australia come to Canada last summer. This has been really effective for new programs getting off the ground. They come and figure out what we're doing, what works, what the vibe of Sing is in the summertime, and they take those lessons back home. I think that might be my last slide, but let's see. Oh, I'll come back to this in Q&A if there's a need for it. I have some terms around decolonization and indigenization. So if it comes up, I can come back to these slides that I think are helpful. Okay, I'll be done and then we can do Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. TallBear. It's
Sure.
very inspiring, the work that you're doing, especially in science and with genomics, something that I think we can learn from in the natural and environmental sciences. So at this time, we would like to open up for Q&A. And please put your question in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can call on you.
Just while you're waiting for a question, so I mostly worked with the tribal environmental scientists when I was a planner, and there was a lot more collaboration already going on and attention to training Native people in environmental science. So I think the genomics was a bit behind where the environmental sciences were. I don't know where it is today, but I certainly take lessons that I got from working in those areas and brought it into the human genome stuff.
Okay. No questions yet. I guess I have a question. Okay, there's one question here from Alexandra Trahan. Are there programs or initiatives that Western scientists can take part in to retrain and decolonize their Western research brain?
Yeah, I got that question last week. So the Australia program is really interesting. And I've been meaning to talk to the same group about this because now this question's come up a couple of times. Australia, because at first I was like, they felt that they actually didn't have enough Indigenous people already in the pipeline to fill all the slots in their Sing program. So they decided to also accept non-Indigenous scientists to come in and have these conversations as well. And I have to talk, I think they felt like it went pretty well. I wonder if, I think there is a need for that. How to do that is interesting because I think we do need an Indigenous only or an Indigenous centered and Indigenous led space sometimes where Native people don't have to worry about saying things in a way that's palatable for non-natives or that doesn't hurt their feelings or where they, so how do we do that? But there's definitely a need for that, I think. And we do have some non-native scientists working with us in Sing, but they do tend to be people that have already done a lot of this decolonial thinking and work, so they're kind of ready to be in that conversation. So I don't really know of programs like that, but it is something I'm thinking about. I agree that we need it. And there needs to be a place for non-native people to go to also take part in these kinds of conversations. So.
Okay, thank you. We have several questions. One that is probably similar to Alexandra, but I'll go ahead and still asks, the Singh project seemed like an inspiring example of ways to serve rather than undermine Indigenous sovereignty. Are there examples of similar programs in other areas, say natural resources, hydrology, land use, etc.?
Well, there's people in this audience that are probably better prepared to answer that than me. I have been getting linked up with some projects in Canada, not in the US, where we're having, because there's a lot of either they're nonprofits running these summer science programs, or the provinces, the natural resource departments, and Natural Resources Canada are running them. But I'm not I left the US 5 or 6 years ago now, so I'm not as aware. But I mean, Carletta, I don't know if you all have resources around that. I will say that the Sing template, people who work in natural resources and wildlife management up here have been interested in taking the template and thinking about how to use that around natural resource training programs, or renewable energy type stuff. So I think we're open to sharing the template. But I don't know of particular programs in the US right now.
Yes, actually, our program that is sponsoring this seminar is Indigenous Food, Energy, Water Security, and Sovereignty. And although our name has Indigenous in it, we have graduate students that are non-Indigenous, and our goal is to train our STEM students in not only in food, energy, water nexus, but also working with Indigenous communities using Indigenous centric approaches. And we have been able to connect with others who have similar projects like these. And I think that question is a really good one. And that's one thing we can follow up on our website to provide those other examples. We have a comment by Christina Orr, and she appreciates what you shared and your experience, and that the idea of as science makes me think of working with tribal nations and supporting citizen sciences
Mhm.
like community health workers that centers the work with community and respecting tribal sovereignty. Rebecca Sosi, great to see you.
Hi,
Uh,
Rebecca.
she has a question. She also expresses her appreciation for your talk. And she's interested in your thoughts on the argument of current scientists that Native people are permitting DNA studies of ancient remains. So all the arguments we made back when are now relevant. Please give us updates from your discussion of Chaco and cultural affiliated remains.
Well, the Chaco article, I think I'm not even sure I was on. So I think we'd have to go to the authors for that. But the ancient DNA, yeah. So the cases that I'm aware of where tribes are permitting it now, it's because they already had long-standing collaborative research relationships in place. So there was already a lot of trust built up. There was already buy-in to the methods. There was already research review on the tribal community level that happened. And so I think that's a really good example of the difference, say, between what happened with the ancient one, or Kennewick man, and some of the other remains that have been found and studied since. There's also, I mean, and I don't know if we were talking about this, Rebecca, back when I was in Arizona, but there has been a lot of I don't like to use the word progress or advance, but there's been a lot of work done in the last 20 years, 15 to 20 years, in terms of figuring out how to broker these research agreements, figuring out what tribal community review looks like, figuring out what the ethical standards are. People have learned how to sign research contracts. There's this concept of DNA on loan that was written about by a couple of people in Canada, but has been taken up south of the border, where the property right in the DNA stays with the community, and different projects and questions are consented as you go along. I mean, there's a lot of innovation that's happened in bioethical procedures, right, since the mid 1990s. And I think that's why now you're seeing some communities agree to study ancient remains. But it's, yeah, it's got to do with feeling empowered in the research process, I think. And that takes a lot of capacity building. And not every tribal community has the time, right? Some communities are really small and they're dealing with many more pressing issues. So that's also always the other, I mean, but Rebecca knows that we've been talking for years about this.
Thank you so much, Kim. I appreciate it so much. You've done tremendous work. Thank you.
Thank you.
So wonderful to witness two amazing women I look up to talking on Zoom. So awesome. We have a question from Kyrina Sosi. What are some ways to empower Indigenous scientists that could lead to more data sovereignty with tribal nations?
Well, there is these native data sovereignty network things that are happening, and so I'm not keeping up on all of this because this is what's so great about Singh. There's so many more people doing this work now that I'm not even sure everything that's going on because so much is going on. So there are Singh alums who are now faculty who are taking the lead globally on this Indigenous data sovereignty stuff. And so there's a network that I think has got people from all of the Singh countries involved. And I wish I had the web pages and the Twitter handles, but I don't have them at the ready. So I'm not the best person to ask about that, but there are people that are doing that work. I think Desi Rodriguez Lone Bear is involved in that, and Desi just took a job at UCLA and will be starting there fairly soon, I think. Maui Hudson from the University of Waikato down in New Zealand. And Desi did her, I think she bought, two PhDs, one from University of Arizona and one from Waikato. So but don't call her and ask her for stuff because I know she's totally overwhelmed, but she's involved if you follow her work and then look at Maui Hudson's work through the Maori Data Sovereignty, you'll begin to see what the network is. And there's a lot of resources out there. I should do my homework.
That's actually how I first met Dr. TallBear when I attended the Indigenous STEM pre-conference in New Zealand. So glad to have her here and speak of her work.
Oh yeah, that's right. That was a good conference.
It was great. Hope we can do that again.
Yeah, and you see what everybody from around the world is working on, right? And yeah.
We have a question from Selena Gray. She's doing research on cultural keystone theory. And she asks that if you're doing human subject research and an advisor wants to include categories, and your target population includes both non and Indigenous peoples, and you are aware as an Indigenous scholar of this history, how can we better analyze data? Do we not categorize people? What are some methods you know of and are exploring?
I'm not quite clear on the question. I mean, I think I partly get it. So how are you actually labeling and naming categories of people in the research? And this is a big question. And I think I talk about this a little bit in my book, and so do other anthropologists of science. It's a much longer conversation than I can entertain here. I'm trying to think where I've seen this conversation play out in something that's like an article that's easily digestible. It is definitely a predicament, right? I mean, we do need to label and name in a sense to talk about things, but we should be aware that we are then reaffirming these kinds of biological categories that are an overly simplistic representation of what exists in the world. I don't have an answer for it. I haven't been thinking about this in many years, but it is a topic I took up a lot in my book. I'm sorry. I wish I could sit down with this person and have this conversation and see like exactly the minutia of what they're dealing with in their research project. But it's a good question. It's a challenge that we confront pretty regularly, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Do you have
we have another probably deep question, but
okay.
It's an interesting one that Daniel Haston brings up, and he asks, what is the difference between anti-colonial and decolonial frameworks? And maybe speak to the use or overuse of the word decolonial amongst white scholars.
Yeah, Torin, can we go to the next slide? I think I've got something on decolonization on that one. Yeah. I don't think I use decolonial and anti-colonial any differently. I mean, I think to me, they're the same thing. But the way that I use decolonization, and I'm pretty careful about it, and I think a lot of people could benefit from this definition, and this person asking this question may very well know this, given the question they're asking. But I use Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's definition in the open access article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And they said decolonization brings about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. So giving back land and giving back life. I think we deal in the Singh program and the work I do with the repatriation of life, and we can talk about that. But they say decolonization is not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. People too easily adopt decolonizing discourse. So decolonize our schools, decolonize methods. Well, what would it mean to decolonize your schools? What does that mean? Does that mean doing a Native American unit to Native American Heritage Month? I don't think so. What are you giving back to Indigenous peoples? So I think you always have to think about that. What are you repatriating? What are you giving back? Because the means for Indigenous life and the proliferation of Indigenous worldviews were robbed from Indigenous people when the land was stolen, when the water is stolen, when people are removed from their lands and territories, when their relationships with non-human beings that help sustain them are disrupted. How can you restore those relations? So Tuck and Yang might talk about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. I would talk about the restoration of relations. We have relations with land. We have relations with non-human relatives. We have relations with our children, with our ancestors, with our communities. Our relations are what were disrupted by colonization. Residential schools disrupted relations with human kin, right? Removal from land disrupted relations with land and non-human relatives. The forbidding people to hunt, disrupting their life ways. So how do we restore that? This requires giving things back materially. It requires restoring Indigenous authority and laws. This is not an easy thing to do. And so that's the way that I use decolonization. And if you're not talking about restoring something material, I don't think you're talking about decolonization. And so I agree, it gets thrown around too much. In the earlier slides, we talked about the difference between decolonization and inclusion. Now we talk in the university a lot about inclusion. We can include Indigenous people. We can rainbow up our laboratory. That's one step. But have you actually critically examined the questions that you're asking in that laboratory, the methods that you're using? The ethical frameworks that you're adhering to, are they only federal ethical frameworks? Are you also adhering to tribal ethical frameworks? That's going beyond inclusion, right? I had 3 levels in these slides. The first one was inclusion. The second one was indigenized reconciliation. And then the third level is decolonization. So this is a big one. And I agree, the word gets misused a lot. It gets watered down.
Thank you, Dr. TallBear. We had several questions that were along the same line of what you just discussed, where there were questions about how a non-Indigenous student going into the STEM could do work with Indigenous communities without harming the community, and also how departments like SNRE could move towards inclusive pedagogy.
Yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. If I were a student and I wanted to work with Indigenous communities, I would make sure that you can't do it yourself only as a student. So you can't do your dissertation as a collaborative research project. It's too much. I would say you need to work with a PI who's already got longstanding relations, who can help you avoid some of the bigger mistakes, where you can learn in a space that's as safe as possible for both you and for the community. But again, the chicken and egg problem is there's not a lot of people out there like that. But I would not attempt to work with an Indigenous community and do it badly. I would not do that. It's better to hold off and look for the right opportunity, because this is about more than a good intention. Our institutions are often not yet where they need to be in terms of facilitating those good relations between laboratories, between scientists, and between communities. I don't know, Carletta, do you have an answer
I think that was a great answer, especially, I think for me, I like to say that there's a lot of partnership building and trust building that has to happen before you even get to developing the research questions with the community, where the community is driving those research questions. So it's not something you could do easily or quickly.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your talk, Dr. TallBear. And thank you for everyone that has joined this seminar. We have many questions that were asked. I think everybody was thinking, and I'm sorry we weren't able to go through all those questions, but I do recommend that you read Dr. TallBear's scholarship to learn more about this topic. Thank you everyone for joining, and please join
Thank
us again. And I see a lot of people clapping in the cameras. So thank you so much. And please join us again. We have our next seminar with Nanaba Lane from Navajo Ethno-Agriculture, who will be talking next month about her work with Indigenous communities in agriculture. Thank you and have a great day
Thanks.
ahead.
Thanks, everybody.